Well, welcome to chapter 12, the letter to the Galatians. Well, class, you're going to see in this book quite a discussion on the critical issues of this book. So let's just jump in and I'll make some comments towards each slide. Paul is identified as the author, and this is one of the undisputed letters of Paul. You just won't find even liberal theologians that want to take on the authorship of this letter. So everyone's in agreement. This is written by Paul, and there is just no criticism against that. But what you will find is quite a bit of ink spilled over the South Galatian theory and the North Galatian theory. Now what I'm going to do is kind of run through quickly on these slides, but I would like to direct your attention really to your discussion in the textbook, page 458, 459, really all the way up to 461. You'll see a very detailed explanation of both of these views. And this is really why I like Carson, because he summarizes these critical issues into a couple of pages where you can kind of get a handle on it before you take on the bigger commentaries. If you're doing an exegesis paper for preaching or for systematic theology or biblical exposition, then you really have to dig in on these critical issues because they are important. But as a survey, let's just take a look at the main issues here. And very simply, well, we would ask the question, what difference does a North or South theory really make? Well, those who advocate a North Galatian theory call the Galatians ethnic Galatians, and those who take the South view look at the various multi-races of people that would be involved in the sharing of the gospel. So that's one reason, but the other reason you'll find over really on page 464. The main point is the issue whether Paul is writing before or after the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15. Now see, it goes into a large argument of whether or not he would have agreed to these issues that come out in the council in Acts 15. I'm going to let you go ahead and read that for yourself and go there. But let's look at the South Galatian theory. We only have information of the people and places that Paul visited in the South. Okay, none of a visit to the North Galatia. The region of Phrygia and Galatia is best understood as a term that means a single territory. Paul normally uses Roman imperial names for provinces. The Galatians is the only word available that embraced all the cities of the first missionary journey. The Galatians contributed to his collection for the believers. That's the cooperative program gift. We like to think of that as the first cooperative program giving. He was taking money to help the believers in Jerusalem during famine. The northern part of the territory was not opened up for commerce like the South. More evidence for the South theory is that it could be less likely that Paul's opponents would have made a difficult journey into the northern region. It would have been easier to follow him in the South, where the land was a little flatter. Galatians 4:14 could be an allusion to Acts 14:12. Okay, so you can look those up. So that's pre-Jerusalem Council, which happens in Acts 15. The great lines of communication ran through the southern cities. Barnabas is mentioned 3 times in the letter, and they only traveled with Paul in the southern cities. Now the other theory is the North Galatian theory, and this, I'll just share with you, class, tends to be an older theory. J.B. Lightfoot was a great proponent of this, and he's one of my heroes of the theological heroes. But he held to the North Galatian theory, though he did have even some doubts. You can see in the footnotes in our textbook. But according to this view, Galatia typically referred to the region occupied by the Gauls in the north. Luke referred to the places according to their geographical locations, Acts 16:6. Another point of support would be that it would have been offensive for Phrygians to have been called Galatians. This is doubtful, according to Carson and Mood. Again, it's unlikely that Paul would have referred to the Lycaonians or Pisidians as foolish Galatians. More support for the North theory is the fickle and superstitious character of Galatians seems to be more fitting to the Gaelic peoples of the North, though Carson and Mood think this is doubtful. The region of Phrygia and Galatia refers to two distinct regions over in Acts 16:6. Paul does not refer to Galatia when he speaks of going to Syria and Cilicia over in the early part of the letter, Galatians 1:21. And there seems to be no hint of opposition on the first missionary journey to the southern cities. Conclusion? Hey, don't you love these? It's impossible to know for certain. But the tilt of the evidence seems to be toward the South Galatian theory. It seems to be more substantial than the North Galatian theory. So as a general rule of thumb, class, if you hold to the North Galatian theory, you're going to take a later date for the writing of the book of the letter of Galatians. The reason is he has to go on the first missionary journey, make his way back, and then start the second missionary journey to get to where we might even be possible that he was in the northern part of Galatia. So, hence, that would be a late date. If you take the southern theory, then you are saying that he made that first missionary journey early, and that's the southern region of this area that the Gauls controlled in the 1st century BC. That could be referred to as Galatia. All right, significant factors favoring the early date. Paul recounts his visits to Jerusalem in Acts 9 and in Acts 11. Doesn't mention the decree of the Apostolic Council, which happens in Acts 15. So if he doesn't mention it in Galatians, it's an argument from silence, but nevertheless, it's evidence. Peter's withdrawal from table fellowship most likely happened before the council. So in other words, if the letter's early and he scolds Peter for not wanting to fellowship with Gentiles, that's, if you take an early date, it's happening before they get to Jerusalem where they make the determination about Gentiles. You see that connection? The North Galatian theory would demand it of a later date. Style and thoughts show affinity with 1st, 2nd Corinthians, and Romans. This would be, that's part of their evidence. Galatians 2 could refer to the Apostolic Council of Acts 15, and that's what they would argue with the later date. The most likely later date visits to Galatia are recounted in Acts 16:6 and 18:23. So if you take the later date, you're going to have to adjust what's happening in Acts 16 and 18, right? So you would have had Jerusalem Council, then you have this late date. So one more piece of evidence. Galatians fits the sequence between 2 Corinthians and Romans. That's what the later date folks would argue. Conclusion. Well, it seems best to hold Paul's 2 visits to Jerusalem as those happening in Acts 9 and 11. Thus, the letter was written slightly before the Apostolic Council, probably AD and 48. So I would recommend, class, that you take right now a moment and in your book, go over to page 461, 462, and somewhere, put this date in there, and I think it'll help you. I wrote mine in the margin, and then you can see that in the 462, if you take a later date, they put it somewhere between 52 to 57. Okay, who are the opponents? Why did Paul write this letter? Well, he's obviously battling somebody. And as you find in your ministries, when you get out there are always going to be people who are disgruntled, folks that are not liking your message or whatever, and there were his opponents. So, who are these opponents? Well, the Jews didn't teach that Christians had to embrace the Torah. Only Jewish Christians did. Okay? So, we're thinking that these opponents are Jews who are Christians, because why would a non-Christian Jew care if Gentiles followed the Torah? They wouldn't, right? It undermines Paul's authority in comparison to other apostles. Okay? It insisted upon circumcision. In other words, these opponents were saying for Gentiles to be Christians, they had to become Jews first, go through the rite of circumcision, and then they could become Christians. So they were persuading Christians to submit to Torah instead of enjoying the freedom in Christ. Paul speaks out against libertarianism. Here again, some regard this sign of a second group of opponents, but probably it's just better to look at this as a perversion of Paul's teaching. And you can read about this in the textbook and, of course, in the letter. But Carson does a good job of pointing you to the text, and he explains this. When Paul talks about don't let your Christian freedom, your freedom in Christ, lead you to sin, so forth. So Paul is preemptively arguing against misunderstanding the freedom of the gospel. There appeared to have been criticizing Paul for teaching circumcision when it suited him. The teaching of the opponents seriously compromised the gospel. Now, you're going to find again, class, another section on the new perspective as it relates to Galatians. Now, we studied the new perspective. You were introduced to it back in chapter, I believe, 11. Excuse me, that would be prior to 11. That would have been back in about chapter 9. So, go back and reread those pages. In fact, I have mine marked. Look back on pages 376, 377, 378, and even over to 379. There's a great explanation. And that's what I really like about this book. He handles the meaty stuff that theologians are in current debate about in Christianity. And the new perspective is huge right now. So get a handle on this, and you'll understand the stuff that you'll be reading in the other in textbooks and current theological books and so forth. I mean, this is really big. Okay, the new perspective. The Jews never thought of keeping the law to gain salvation, according to new perspective. Okay, This does not take into account Jewish teaching of rewards of righteousness and seriousness of sin. This second bullet point is a criticism of the new perspective. And I would agree with Carson on this. Paul was not concerned with justification per se, but Christology. The Jews never expected the law to save them. The problem was that they rejected Jesus. Okay, this corrective cannot overlook that justification by faith in Christ is by nature opposed to any justification by works. Sanders argues that Paul works from solution to plight. He starts with Christ and then works backwards to his view of sin. But Thielman argues against this, that Paul begins in Romans and Galatians with the plight and works toward the solution in Christ. You see the difference? So he makes clear that the cross is the only way to salvation, and Paul emphasizes Christian freedom. That's the heritage that is in Christ. All right, now go back and read these chapters. Go back to the initial discussion back there in chapter 9, and then this will make more sense to you. You're going to have to work with this new perspective thing a little bit, because it's quite a different view than what you're probably used to hearing. But there you have it. That's the book of Galatians.